The galaxy was a fractured mess. For over 1,000 years, the so-called Great Powers, the Zelvari Dominion, the Theronic Hegemony, the Urva Syndicate, and a dozen other ruling factions, had squabbled, waged wars, and formed alliances that crumbled as quickly as they were built. Diplomacy was a thin veil over deep-seated grudges, and every species looked out for itself. Into this chaos entered humanity. At first, the other species barely noticed them. The Terran Union, as they called themselves, was just another fledgling power on the galactic stage, barely 3 centuries into spacefaring civilization. They lacked the numbers of the Zelvari, the war fleets of the Theronic, and the economic stranglehold of the Urva. Yet, there was something different about them, something the galaxy had never seen before. They didn't just survive. They thrived. While other species built empires on conquest, humanity built theirs on cooperation. When they fought wars, they rebuilt their enemies afterward. Where others hoarded technology, humans shared. And somehow, impossibly, they kept making friends. And that terrified the Great Powers. The turning point came at the Battle of Vordash Prime. The Zelvari Dominion, desperate to stamp out what they saw as a growing human threat, launched a preemptive strike against one of humanity's key colonies. They expected an easy victory. They did not expect humanity's response. The Terran Union had no vast armadas, no ancient war doctrines honed over millennia. What they had were brilliantly unpredictable strategies and a fierce, undying loyalty to their own. The Zelvari fleet, superior in firepower, was lured into a gravitational trap that turned their own mass against them. Within hours, what should have been a crushing Zelvari victory turned into a humiliating defeat. But what happened after the battle stunned the galaxy even more. Instead of executing prisoners, instead of seeking vengeance, the Terran Union extended an offer to the defeated Zelvari: peace, trade, and technological aid. Even as the Dominion licked its wounds, many of its citizens and even some of its war-weary generals started whispering that perhaps, just perhaps, these humans were onto something. And that was what made them dangerous. The Theronic Hegemony saw it next. Their spies reported that smaller factions, nations long crushed under the boots of the Great Powers, were aligning with humanity, not out of fear, but out of choice. The Urva Syndicate, built on ruthless economic manipulation, found their monopolies crumbling as human-led coalitions undermined their stranglehold with fairer trade policies. The old order of the galaxy, one built on endless conflict and backstabbing politics, was changing. For the first time in history, a species wasn't interested in being the dominant force in the galaxy. Humanity didn't want a throne, they wanted a council. They didn't want vassals, they wanted partners. And the terrifying thing was that it was working. The galaxy teetered on the edge of something unprecedented. Some saw hope. Some saw opportunity. And some, the most powerful of all, saw a threat that needed to be eliminated before it was too late. And so, the galaxy prepared for what many feared would be its final war. The aftermath of the Battle of Vordash Prime had left the galaxy reeling. Not from the physical destruction, though the battle was costly in its own right, but from the ideological shift that followed. Humanity's victory had not just been a tactical one, it had been a demonstration of something far more dangerous: unity. It was the first real evidence that a diverse, fractured galaxy could stand together as one. For centuries, the galaxy had been divided into factions that clung to their own ways of life, often through fear and intimidation. But humanity's message was simple: together, we are stronger. The Terran Union began to move quickly, seeking alliances with former enemies, mediating disputes between rival species, and offering trade agreements that promised prosperity for all. The other factions could not ignore this new power for long, but the question was, would they be able to stop it before it became unstoppable? The first test of this new order came when the Zelvari Dominion, still licking its wounds from Vordash Prime, decided that it would not bow to human ideals. Led by Empress Valori, a cold and calculating leader who had risen to power on the backs of fear and aggression, the Dominion made a bold move. They summoned their fleet to the border of Terran space, preparing for a confrontation that would silence the upstart humans once and for all. But what they didn't expect was the speed with which humanity responded. The Terran Union's military was no match for the Dominions in sheer power, but it wasn't about raw strength, it was about strategic ingenuity. In a series of covert operations, human diplomats had quietly infiltrated the Dominion's trade routes and financial systems, sowing distrust and turning local colonies against the Empress's rule. By the time the Zelvari fleet arrived at the border, it found not a single human warship waiting to engage them, but rather, a network of neutral and allied ships, each standing firm in the name of peace and cooperation. "Should we engage?" one of the Dominion commanders asked. Valori, her face tight with anger, watched the unfolding situation. "No," she said, her voice dripping with disdain. "Let us see what they think they can accomplish. We shall not fire the first shot. But we will make sure they understand the price of failure." On the other side of the negotiation table, a human envoy, Captain Leah Calloway, faced the Dominion's negotiators with an unflinching calmness. She had seen the chaos that could come from these confrontations, and she was not going to let her people be part of another needless war. The terms she offered were simple: mutual demilitarization, joint exploration of neutral territories, and the formation of a shared council that would have the authority to resolve disputes without bloodshed. The Dominion's emissary sneered at her proposal. "You speak of peace, yet we are still at war. How can we trust you?" "We've already won the trust of your people," Captain Calloway replied, her eyes sharp. "We don't need to trust you. We need to work together." The galaxy had never seen anything like it. Species who had once been locked in a centuries-long struggle for dominance now found themselves in a position where they could either join a new era of unity, or be left behind. Behind the scenes, the Galactic Council, a newly formed coalition of various races and factions, began to take shape. What started as a loose gathering of human allies soon grew into something far more substantial. The Theronic hegemony, seeing the tide of change, reluctantly joined. The Irva Syndicate followed soon after, desperate to secure trade deals that would give them an edge. Even the reclusive Arcthean Collective, who had always remained outside galactic politics, sent emissaries to attend. But not everyone was happy with the rise of the final Federation. The Zither Dominion, an ancient and prideful species, viewed the Federation as an affront to their status. Their High Commander, Thak Zor, gathered his warlords and began to secretly mobilize his fleet. It was clear that he believed the humans were trying to rewrite the galaxy's rules, and he would not stand for it. The stage was set. Would the Federation succeed in ushering in a new era of peace and prosperity, or would the galaxy plunge into one last, final war? The stakes had never been higher. The formation of the final Federation seemed unstoppable. Across the galaxy, smaller factions were rapidly joining the cause, their leaders signing treaties and attending the newly established galactic summits with a fervor that seemed to reflect the hope of a new era. But despite the diplomatic victories and widespread support, the most powerful forces, the Zither Dominion and their allies, began to prepare for the one thing they feared: resistance. High Commander Thak Zor of the Zither Dominion had never been one to play politics. His reputation was built on battlefield conquests, not negotiation tables. To him, the idea of a galactic council was nothing short of an insult to the age-old traditions of his people. The Zither were an ancient species, having ruled vast star systems for millennia, and they would not bend to the will of a species that had only recently begun to grasp the true power of the stars. In secret, Thak Zor began rallying his warlords. Through a network of covert communications and hidden meetings, he sowed the seeds of rebellion. With a fleet of Zither warships poised at the edges of Federation space, the galaxy stood on the edge of a knife. Humanity's response was, as always, a curious blend of diplomacy and action. The Terran Union's leaders, spearheaded by President Maris Kane, knew that conflict with the Zither was inevitable, but they also understood that there was still a chance to prevent it. Diplomacy remained the Federation's most powerful weapon, and President Kane was not willing to give up on it just yet. "We cannot afford to let fear guide us," President Kane declared in a speech broadcast across the galaxy. "The Zither want us to act with aggression, to meet their challenge with violence. But we know there is more strength in unity than in division. We will offer peace, one last time." Her words were met with a mix of skepticism and hope. The Zither had a reputation for brutal efficiency, and many species doubted that they would ever accept anything less than the destruction of the Federation. But Kane's speech had a profound effect. For the first time, many across the galaxy saw humanity's resolve not as weakness, but as a strength that transcended even the most aggressive of adversaries. And so, a delegation was sent, led by Captain Leah Calloway, the same diplomat who had defused the situation with the Zelvari. She was joined by ambassadors from several other Federation members, each eager to avoid bloodshed. The meeting was set to take place on the neutral moon of Oparis, located in a disputed sector of space. When the human delegation arrived at Oparis, the sight that greeted them was one of stark tension. The Zither warships, massive and intimidating, surrounded the moon, their guns trained on the peaceful ships of the Federation. High Commander Thak Zor himself stood at the forefront, flanked by his most trusted generals, each a hulking figure in dark, menacing armor. "You are brave to come," Thak Zor's voice echoed across the comms. "But your cowardice is clear. You come not with weapons, but with words." Captain Calloway stepped forward, her face calm but resolute. "We come with the only weapon we have, the hope that peace can still be achieved. The Federation is not here to conquer the galaxy, Commander Zor. We are here to unite it." For a moment, the Zither High Commander said nothing, his cold gaze fixed on her. The silence stretched long, oppressive. It felt like the galaxy itself held its breath. Would this be the moment everything broke apart, or the moment the final war could be avoided? Thak Zor broke the silence with a single, harsh laugh. "Unity. You speak of unity as though it is a gift to be handed out. You do not understand the nature of strength. I see only weakness. And I will not allow it to spread." But it wasn't the words that caught Captain Calloway's attention, it was the hesitation. For the first time, there was doubt in the Zither commander's eyes. She could sense it, even through the cold exterior. Something had shifted, just enough for her to see a sliver of the man he had once been before the wars had consumed him. "Your people have been at war for far too long, Commander," she said softly, her voice carrying the weight of 1,000 lives lost in vain. "You're not alone in your pain. All of us have known loss. But we have learned something through it, that war doesn't bring us strength. It takes it away." The silence stretched again, but this time, it was different. The Zither commander, proud as he was, did not respond with the same fiery rage. Instead, he stood still, lost in thought. The Federation's delegation held their breath. The galaxy held its breath. And for the first time in centuries, the galaxy seemed on the verge of something that had never existed before, true peace. But would the Zither be willing to embrace it? Or would their unyielding pride drag the galaxy into one final, bloody war? The silence that followed Captain Calloway's words was the longest moment of her life. It wasn't just the Zither High Commander who had to decide whether to embrace peace, the entire galaxy was holding its collective breath. This delicate moment could tip the scales in either direction. Captain Calloway had made the offer, but it was now up to Thak Zor and his people to choose, to step into the future of the Federation or to drag the galaxy back into another era of bloodshed. Finally, Thak Zor's voice crackled through the comms once again, low and menacing. "I see what you're trying to do, human. But you underestimate the power of my people. Your Federation cannot force us to kneel, nor will we ever accept your vision of unity. It is not in our blood." Despite the harsh words, Calloway remained calm. She could see the uncertainty in his eyes, just beneath the facade of arrogance. She knew this was not about logic, it was about honor. Zor's pride was a weapon more dangerous than his fleet. But it was also a weakness. And she wasn't going to let it dictate the fate of the galaxy. "We don't want to destroy you, Commander. We want to build something better," Calloway countered, her voice steady. "Something that will outlast all of us. Your people are strong, but you don't have to face this future alone. Join us. Together, we can be more than conquerors. We can be creators." There was a pause. For a moment, Captain Calloway thought she might have pushed too far. But then, something unexpected happened. Thak-Zor's expression softened ever so slightly, a brief flicker of something deeper behind his hardened features. It wasn't agreement, but it was the first hint of something approaching consideration. Enough, Zor growled. I will consider your offer. But don't mistake this for surrender. The Zither will never bow. With that, the transmission cut off, and the Zither fleet withdrew. It wasn't a victory for the Federation, but it wasn't a defeat either. The galaxy, on the brink of war, had averted the worst for the moment, but the danger was far from over. Back in Federation space, President Maris Kane and her council were in a state of tense anticipation. The Zither had not outright rejected the peace talks, but neither had they accepted them. The Federation's future rested on the fragile hope that Zor's pride would not push him to war. The question on everyone's mind was, how long could this peace last? As the days passed, smaller factions, spurred on by humanity's example, continued to rally around the Federation, forming an unprecedented alliance that crossed species lines. From the Zelvari to the Theronic, from the peaceful Shallan to the war-hardened Noriacs, more and more star systems began to see the potential of a united galaxy. Even the Arcthean Collective, once an isolationist empire, began to open their borders to the Federation. But still, the shadow of the Zither Dominion loomed large. Some of the smaller species, nervous about Zor's intentions, began to arm themselves. Entire sectors of space saw military buildups, as old grudges resurfaced and new alliances formed. The galaxy had been at war for so long that even a fragile peace could feel like an illusion. Then, without warning, the unthinkable happened. A rogue faction of Zither warlords, led by Commander Rog Zor, Thak-Zor's younger brother, launched a surprise attack on a Federation-controlled world at the edge of the Operis system. The strike was swift and brutal, a clear message from the Zither: if peace would not come willingly, it would be forced through fire and blood. News of the attack spread like wildfire. The Federation's allies were torn. Would they honor their promises of peace, or would they now be drawn into a war they had tried so hard to avoid? Humanity stood at the center of the storm, as it had so many times before, but this time, the stakes were higher. This wasn't just a matter of protecting one planet, it was a battle for the soul of the galaxy itself. President Kane, with the full weight of the Federation behind her, made a decision that would change everything. She didn't call for a retaliatory strike. Instead, she called for an emergency summit, an open invitation to every faction, every power, every species. We will not let the actions of a few fanatics tear us apart. We must stand together. For the first time in centuries, all eyes turned toward the Federation. Would humanity's resolve be enough to hold the galaxy's fractured pieces together, or would this spark the beginning of a new and final war? The choice was now in the hands of the galaxy's leaders, and they would have to choose quickly. Time was running out. The emergency summit convened in the heart of the Federation's capital, a neutral moon orbiting the peaceful world of Helios Prime. It was a symbol of humanity's enduring commitment to unity, but it was also a battleground for the very future of the galaxy. Representatives from over 200 systems filled the massive halls, each with their own grievances, ambitions, and fears. The Federation's invitation had been a gamble, one that could either secure peace or ignite the war that Thak-Zor and his rogue faction sought. Yet the stakes were too high to back down now. President Maris Kane knew that the only way to avoid a total collapse of the Federation was to maintain the image of unity at all costs. The galaxy had never been more fragile. As the summit began, tensions were palpable. The Zelvari, represented by Empress Valori herself, were there, their eyes burning with suspicion. The Theronic hegemony's leaders, aloof and calculating, watched carefully, unwilling to show their cards too soon. The representatives from the Arcthean Collective were noticeably absent, their inscrutable nature keeping everyone guessing about their true intentions. But it was the Zither delegates, led by the ever-imposing Thak-Zor himself, that dominated the room. "We do not gather here to bow to weak ideals," Zor's voice thundered as the summit's first session began. "The Zither will never fall under the rule of anyone, least of all the fragile union you pretend to lead." His words were sharp, full of defiance. Yet, there was something in his demeanor that had changed since the encounter at Operis, an underlying weariness, a sense that the Zither had been fighting an unwinnable war for far too long. Captain Leah Calloway, standing alongside President Kane, met Zor's gaze head-on. "You don't have to fight anymore, Commander Zor. The Federation is not here to dominate, it is here to unite. Your people are too strong to remain in isolation, to continue fighting. There is another way." Zor's eyes narrowed. "Your way is the way of submission, human. You cannot change the blood that runs in our veins." "We are not asking you to change your blood," Calloway replied, her voice unwavering. "We're asking you to understand that strength doesn't come from fighting alone. It comes from standing with others. You don't have to be the last of the Zither, Commander. You can be a part of something greater." The room fell silent. The weight of the words hung heavily in the air. But not all were convinced. A rising voice broke the stillness, an urgent shout from one of the smaller factions, the Vortec Alliance, whose systems had suffered heavy losses in the early wars. "Enough with your speeches," the Vortec ambassador cried, pounding his fist on the table. "You speak of unity, but all I see is weakness. The Zither will never be tamed. And what happens when your human peace fails? What happens when we are all left defenseless against these invaders?" His outburst sparked murmurs of agreement, echoing across the chamber. Many of the smaller factions, who had lived through centuries of conflict, feared the promise of peace was just that, a promise that would collapse under the weight of aggression. And then, they would be left with nothing but ashes. President Kane stood, her gaze sweeping the room. The question was clear: would the Federation's grand vision of unity stand, or would it fracture into 1,000 competing interests, each torn apart by distrust and fear? Humanity had already given everything to this idea, but would the galaxy follow? "We know this isn't easy," Kane began, her voice calm but resolute. "But we are at a crossroads. If we let fear dictate our decisions, we will be lost. If we stand together, we can build a future where no one is left behind. We have already begun this journey. We have seen that it works." She turned her attention to the Zelvari delegation. "Empress Valori, you once believed in the supremacy of your people. Yet, today, you stand with us. The same can be true for all of us." Valori's sharp eyes flicked to President Kane. The Empress had been one of the staunchest critics of the Federation, but she had come to see the humans as an undeniable force. "I have seen the strength of your alliances," she said slowly. "Perhaps it is time to consider that the galaxy's future does not lie in conquest." At that moment, a new voice entered the conversation, unexpected, but with the power to shift everything. It was the representative from the Arcthean Collective, a species known for their calculated and often dispassionate approach to galactic matters. Their envoy, High Counselor Oral, spoke softly but with authority. "Perhaps," Oral said, "we have all been looking at the problem in the wrong light. Strength does not come from endless wars, nor does it come from submission. It comes from cooperation, the willingness to set aside old hatreds. We have waited on the sidelines long enough. It is time for us to choose where we stand." The room went quiet. This was a moment the galaxy had been waiting for. The Arctheans, reclusive and enigmatic, had been the wild card in every galactic equation. Now, they were throwing their weight behind the Federation. The other factions, uncertain but intrigued, began to shift. The Zither, caught between pride and pragmatism, seemed torn. Thakzor remained unmoving, but his eyes flickered to the faces of his delegates. He had always prided himself on his ability to bend others to his will, but now, for the first time, he was being forced to consider that the galaxy might be shifting in a direction he had never anticipated. "We have fought long enough," Zor finally muttered, his voice low but resolute. Perhaps it is time for something new." The room erupted into a storm of whispers. The turning point had arrived. The Federation was no longer an uncertain idea, it was becoming a reality. The question now was not whether the galaxy would embrace it, but whether they could stay united through the coming trials. And, above all, the galaxy had to answer one final, crucial question: could they face the future together, or would they crumble under the weight of their own fear? The events of the summit marked a turning point, but the real work had only just begun. The galaxy's fate hung in a delicate balance. The Federation had made major strides toward peace and unity, but the rogue Zither factions, emboldened by their previous victories, would not simply fade into the background. High Commander Thak Zor's acceptance of the Federation's terms had been a calculated move, one that would allow him to keep his honor intact while participating in the new Galactic Order. But there were still many who questioned whether Zor could truly be trusted to honor the fragile peace. Back in Federation-controlled space, President Maris Kane faced a difficult decision. The support of the smaller factions, who had been wary of the Federation's unity efforts, was now in her grasp, but it was far from guaranteed. To maintain the peace, Kane needed to prove that humanity's vision of the future was more than just an ideal, it had to be a living, breathing reality that could deliver results. In the wake of the summit, Kane ordered the establishment of the Unified Peacekeepers, an elite, multi-species force designed to monitor the borders of Federation space, mediate conflicts, and ensure that no power could simply steamroll weaker factions under the guise of order. It was a bold decision, one that was sure to make waves across the galaxy. But it also demonstrated the Federation's unwavering commitment to justice for all. Captain Leah Calloway, whose diplomatic skills had played a crucial role in the Federation's ascent, was appointed as the leader of the Unified Peacekeepers. Her first assignment was no small task. The Zither, still uncertain of their role within the Federation, had begun to make aggressive moves along the border of Federation space. Small skirmishes broke out between Zither patrols and Federation defense forces, and it became clear that Zor's acceptance of the peace talks had done little to quell the deep-seated animosity among his people. Peace is never easy to maintain, Calloway mused, reviewing intelligence reports in the quiet of her flagship, the Libertas. But we cannot allow fear to dictate our actions. We must be prepared to enforce the unity we've promised. As the Federation deployed peacekeeper fleets to contain the unrest, Commander Zor's actions became more erratic. He still publicly espoused support for the Federation's goals, but his younger brother, Rog Zor, continued to rally rogue warlords to his cause. The rogue Zither factions were growing in power, ready to launch a new series of strikes designed to destabilize the Federation's unity. And then came the unthinkable, a surprise attack on a vital trade route, cutting off supplies to dozens of Federation worlds. The strike, launched by Rog Zor's faction, was calculated to send a message: the Zither would not be bound by human ideals. The Federation had no choice but to act quickly. Captain Calloway, now at the head of the Peacekeeper fleet, was dispatched to confront the rogue forces. The mission was not just to quell the rebellion, but to bring the Zither back to the table, by force, if necessary. The fleet clashed in the depths of space, between the glittering lights of distant stars, as the Unified Peacekeepers engaged the rogue Zither in battle. The Federation forces, a diverse coalition of species and technologies, fought with precision and unity, proving that their collective strength was more than the sum of its parts. The Zither, however, were relentless, warriors bred for conquest, with an unmatched tenacity and savagery. In the heat of the battle, Calloway's flagship, the Libertas, found itself face-to-face with Rog Zor's personal warship, the Tyranny. The two ships exchanged fire in a brutal exchange, their shields crackling under the intensity of the blasts. But in the midst of the conflict, Calloway saw an opportunity. The Zither were not fighting to conquer, they were fighting to preserve their pride. This was the key. Calloway opened a direct channel to Rog Zor, her voice steady despite the chaos unfolding around her. "Commander Zor," she said, "this battle does not need to be fought. You are not alone. The Federation is not trying to enslave your people. We are offering you a place among us, where your strength is valued, not wasted in endless conflict." For a moment, there was silence on the line. Then, Rog Zor's voice crackled through, full of frustration. "You speak of unity, but you do not understand the weight of our history, Captain Calloway. We have fought for millennia to preserve our way of life. You cannot ask us to discard it so easily." "I'm not asking you to forget who you are," she replied softly. "But the galaxy is changing, Commander. The old ways are dying. You can choose to fight against it, or you can choose to stand with us. Together, we can create something that will outlast the wars of the past. Rog-Zor hesitated. He had been fighting for so long that the idea of peace felt alien to him, like an old, rusted relic. Yet, beneath the anger and frustration, there was a part of him that saw the truth in Calloway's words. In that moment, a decision was made. Rog-Zor ordered his fleet to stand down. The rogue Zither forces, unable to continue the fight without their leader, reluctantly followed suit. The battle was over. With the conflict settled, the Federation and the Zither came to the negotiating table once again. But this time, it wasn't just a negotiation, it was the beginning of a true partnership. High Commander Thak-Zor, having recognized the growing strength of the Federation, reluctantly agreed to join the Unified Council of the Final Federation, securing the Zither's place within the new order. The Federation was no longer a distant dream, it was a reality. The galaxy was on the verge of an unprecedented era of peace and cooperation. But the true test had just begun. Could they maintain this unity through the challenges that lay ahead? The rise of the Final Federation was not just a victory, it was a promise. The promise of a galaxy that would stand together, no matter the cost. The galaxy, once fractured and torn by millennia of war and distrust, now stood on the cusp of an unparalleled new era. The Final Federation, forged in the crucible of conflict, was not merely an alliance of convenience, it had become a living testament to the potential of unity. From the smallest planetary system to the vast, star-studded expanse of the Zither Dominion, each world had been touched by the promise of something greater than war. The Federation was now a reality, and it would shape the future of the galaxy in ways no one could yet fully comprehend. For President Maris Kane, the weight of this success was both exhilarating and overwhelming. The path to this moment had been long and arduous, filled with both triumphs and failures. Yet, as she gazed out at the capital from her office window, she knew that the future of the Federation had only just begun. It wasn't enough to simply achieve peace, it had to be sustained. It had to be nurtured. Unity was never meant to be easy, she said to herself, as her hand traced the map of Federation territories that now sprawled across her desk. It was a vast network of interconnected worlds, each with its own history, its own people. But for the first time, they were bound together by more than just treaties or necessity. They were bound by a shared vision, a vision that was being carried forward by those who had believed in the impossible. Humanity had led the way, but now the galaxy was walking alongside them. Captain Leah Calloway, once a rogue officer known for her brash methods, stood as a symbol of the new order. As commander of the unified peacekeepers, she had seen the worst of the galaxy, and yet her belief in the Federation's potential never wavered. Now, as she patrolled the borders, ensuring peace and stability, she found herself more hopeful than ever. Despite the scars of war, the galaxy was healing. And she was part of that healing. But the final test of the Federation was yet to come. The rogue elements of the Zither, though defeated, had not fully accepted the Federation's rule. Their influence still lingered in the dark corners of the galaxy, and while High Commander Thak-Zor had pledged allegiance to the Federation, the internal struggle for Zither dominance remained. If left unchecked, it could destabilize the fragile peace. Rog-Zor, Thak's younger brother, had retreated to the farthest reaches of Zither space, rallying the last remnants of his loyalists. It was clear that the warlords of old had not given up the fight, they simply had bided their time. The Federation's leadership had to make a choice: would they let the fire of rebellion smolder and grow, or would they take decisive action to extinguish it once and for all? It was Leah Calloway who proposed the solution. We cannot afford to let the Zither tear apart what we've built. We must show them that the Federation will not tolerate any threats to peace. But we cannot simply crush them. We need to offer them a way out, one last chance to join us, to be part of the future. President Kane agreed, though the decision was a difficult one. This is not just about military power, Captain. It's about showing that the Federation is a force for good. If we destroy them outright, we risk everything we've worked for. But if we can unite the Zither completely, we solidify the Federation's hold on the galaxy. In a move that surprised many, the Federation offered a new peace treaty to the Zither rebels, led by Rog-Zor. The terms were clear: lay down arms, join the Federation, and help build the future, or face utter annihilation. The message was blunt, but it was also a final offer. The time for war was over. The response was not immediate, but when it came, it was swift and decisive. Rog-Zor, his pride bruised but his pragmatism intact, chose to accept the Federation's terms. He sent envoys to the peace table, signaling that the Zithar were ready to lay down their weapons and join the galaxy's new order. It was a historic moment. The Zithar, once feared and reviled across the galaxy, were now officially part of the Federation, not as conquerors but as equals. And with that, the final remnants of galactic war faded into history. The peace that had seemed so improbable, so impossible just years ago, had been achieved. But the Federation's work was far from over. It was still a young entity, and there were challenges ahead. The economic disparities between systems had to be addressed. The cultures of hundreds of species had to be integrated into a cohesive whole. And the threat of external dangers, unknown alien forces, ancient weapons of war, and the unpredictable nature of galactic politics, still loomed. Yet, for the first time in history, the galaxy was united, not through fear or subjugation, but through a shared belief in something greater. Humanity had led the way, not by dominating, but by offering a hand to those who were willing to stand side by side. The Federation was proof that even the most fractured of worlds could be healed, that old wounds could be forgiven, and that the future could be brighter than anyone had ever dared to imagine. And as President Kane, Captain Calloway, and the leaders of the galaxy looked out across the stars, they knew that they were on the cusp of something truly extraordinary. The final Federation had been born, and with it, the promise of an enduring peace. The galaxy would never be the same. The story of humanity's rise, and the unity it had forged, would echo through the ages as a testament to the power of peace. And though the road ahead would never be without challenges, it would always be lit by the light of hope, the hope that, together, the galaxy could build something that lasted forever.